The moment Winifred Talbot stepped off the stagecoach in Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1879, she knew with absolute certainty that she had made either the bravest decision of her life or the most foolish one, and she had not yet determined which. The town stretched before her in a haze of red dust and afternoon heat, a collection of weathered wooden storefronts and muddy streets that bore no resemblance to the painted picture she had carried in her imagination during the long, bone-rattling journey from St. Louis. She had left behind a quiet life of careful embroidery and careful words, and carefully arranged disappointments, the kind of existence that accumulated around a woman like sediment in a slow-moving river, until she could barely breathe beneath the weight of it. She had answered the advertisement in the Missouri Examiner on a whim, or what she had told herself was a whim, though in truth she had read it 17 times over the course of 3 weeks before finally sitting down with pen and paper at the kitchen table while her aunt slept in the next room. Wanted: a capable woman of good character to assist in the running of a cattle ranch outside Caldwell, Kansas. Must be willing to work. References required. Inquire to Mr. Harold Fenwick, Fenwick Ranch, Caldwell, Kansas Territory. She was 24 years old, which her aunt considered already too old for a woman who had not yet secured a husband, and she had brought with her 2 leather trunks, a set of bone-handled knives that had belonged to her father, a modest sum of savings, and a disposition that her former schoolteacher had once described as both her greatest strength and her most considerable liability. She refused, under almost any circumstances, to give up on a thing once she had decided it was worth fighting for. The stagecoach driver, a broad, sunburned man with a permanent squint, heaved her trunks onto the boardwalk with considerably less ceremony than she might have hoped, tipped his hat without looking at her, and climbed back up to his seat. Winifred straightened her back, adjusted the brim of her hat against the Kansas sun, and surveyed the street. Caldwell in 1879 was a cattle town in every sense of the word, positioned at the edge of the Kishom Trail, where the Longhorn drives came up out of Texas each spring and summer. The smell of it reached her before the sight did, the particular combination of livestock and leather and wood smoke, and something underneath it all that might have been freedom or might have been dust. She could not decide. Men in broad-brimmed hats moved along the boardwalks with the unhurried confidence of people who belonged somewhere, and from inside one of the saloons came the tinny sound of a piano playing a song she almost recognized. She picked up her smaller bag and walked toward the general store, because she had been told in a letter from Harold Fenwick that if she arrived before he did, she should wait there and ask for a woman named Dorothea Briggs, who would see her settled. She had barely pushed open the door of the general store when a young woman with copper-colored hair and a flour-dusted apron appeared from behind a long wooden counter and looked her over with frank, unashamed curiosity. "You must be the woman from St. Louis," the young woman said. "I am Dorothea. Thea, if you find the other too much to manage." "Winifred Talbot," Winifred said, extending her hand. "And I assure you I can manage Dorothea perfectly well." Thea grinned at that, a wide, unguarded expression that immediately made Winifred feel something loosen in her chest. "Good. I cannot stand women who apologize for their names. Mr. Fenwick sent word that he would be in town by sundown. Until then, you can sit in the back and have coffee, and I will tell you everything you need to know about this place, which is considerable." What Thea told her, over the next 2 hours and 2 cups of exceptionally strong coffee, was both more and less reassuring than Winifred had hoped. Fenwick Ranch was one of the larger operations in the area, with a herd of several hundred head that would be driven north to the railhead at the end of summer. Harold Fenwick was a decent man, recently widowed, who had 3 children under the age of 12, and who needed someone to run his household and tutor his children while he focused on the ranch. It was not, Thea emphasized with the careful delicacy of someone navigating a diplomatically sensitive subject, a matrimonial arrangement. He had made that plain in his advertisement. He wanted a housekeeper and a teacher, not a wife. Which is perfectly fine, Winifred said, because it was. Of course, Thea agreed, though she watched Winifred's face a moment longer than necessary before continuing. There was, however, one other thing Winifred should know about the ranch, Thea said, refilling both their cups with the easy authority of a woman who considered information sharing a civic duty. Harold Fenwick had a foreman. His name was Henry Hadley. He had been with the Fenwick operation for 4 years, having come up from Texas with the first drive and simply never left. He was, by most accounts, one of the best working cowboys in the region, the kind of man who understood cattle the way some people understood music or mathematics, intuitively and completely. Is he difficult? Winifred asked, because in her experience, the way a person spoke carefully around a subject usually indicated that the subject had edges. Thea considered this with the seriousness it apparently deserved. Not difficult, she said finally. Careful, he does not trust quickly. Fenwick's wife, Clara, she died 18 months ago and Henry took it hard. They were not a romantic attachment, nothing like that, but she was a good woman and she had kept the household in order and she had been kind to Henry and to the children. Her absence was felt by everyone on that ranch. She paused. He may not welcome you immediately. I have not come to Kansas to be welcomed, Winifred said. I have come to be useful. Thea smiled again, and this time it reached her eyes. I think, she said, that you and I are going to get along very well. Harold Fenwick arrived at precisely the time promised, which Winifred noted as a positive sign of character. He was a stocky man in his late 30s with a sun-weathered face, and the kind of quiet sadness that settles into a person's eyes after grief has had time to calcify into something permanent but bearable. He was courteous and straightforward in equal measure, walked her out to the ranch wagon with her trunks, explained the particulars of her situation in clear language, and asked only one personal question during the entire 2-hour ride to the ranch. You came a long way, Miss Talbot. Are you certain this is what you want? I am certain I wanted to leave, she said honestly. I believe this is what I want. I suppose I will know more clearly in a few weeks. He seemed to appreciate the honesty, and the rest of the ride passed in companionable near silence, broken only by the occasional comment about the landscape, which was, in Winifred's opinion, the most extraordinary thing she had ever seen in her life. The Kansas plain opened around her in every direction like a great golden breathing thing, the grass moving in the wind with a sound like the turning of 1,000 pages, the sky above it so enormous and so purely blue that it made her feel simultaneously very small, and, for the first time in a very long time, very free. The ranch came into view just as the light was beginning to turn golden. It was a substantial property, more organized than she had expected, with a main house of considerable size, several outbuildings, a large barn, and a network of fenced pastures stretching away to the east and south. She could see cattle in the middle distance, dark shapes moving slowly through the grass, and the sound of horses came from the direction of the corral. 3 children appeared on the porch of the main house as the wagon rolled in, stair-stepped in size. The oldest a serious-faced girl of 11 named Margaret, the middle one a boy of 9 named Thomas, who was already asking questions before the wagon had fully stopped, and the youngest a boy of 6 named Samuel, who looked at Winifred with enormous dark eyes and said nothing at all but reached out and took hold of the hem of her traveling coat as she stepped down, and simply held on. Something moved in Winifred's chest, immediate and involuntary. She reached down and took his small hand properly in hers, and he allowed this with great dignity. "Hello, Samuel," she said. "Hello," he said very quietly, and that was the beginning of everything. She did not meet Henry Hadley that first evening. She was occupied with the children and the house and the long, disorienting work of understanding a new place, and by the time supper was cleared away and the children were in bed, she was too exhausted to do more than locate her room and fall into the narrow bed with its clean cotton quilt and sleep the deep, dreamless sleep of the thoroughly worn out. She met him the next morning. She had risen early, before the household stirred, driven by the deep-rooted habit of early rising that had been instilled in her since childhood and which she had never successfully shaken. She dressed quickly and went to the kitchen, intending to start the fire and begin breakfast, only to find that the fire was already going and a man was standing at the back door with a mug of coffee, looking out at the early light spreading across the grassland. He was tall and lean in the way of men who have spent years on horseback, with broad shoulders and the kind of hands, she noticed immediately, that were capable and sure in their movements without any appearance of effort. His hair was dark and needed cutting. He wore a plain shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows despite the early morning chill, and when he heard her footstep he turned, and she saw his face. He was perhaps 28 or 30, with dark eyes under a straight brow and a jaw that was set with the particular firmness of a man who had made a private decision and was not interested in revisiting it. He was not unhandsome. He was, in fact, considerably more than that, though Winifred had the presence of mind not to register this on her face. "You must be Miss Talbot," he said. His voice was low and even with a Texas flatness beneath it. "And you must be Mr. Hadley," she said. "Henry," he said in the tone of a man who considers formality a kind of waste. "The children's cook usually comes in at 7, coffee's on the stove." "Thank you," she said. "I can make breakfast. I am not here to stand idle." Something shifted in his expression, though what it shifted into was difficult to read. He looked at her a moment longer than was strictly polite, then turned back to the door and the morning light. "Breakfast is at 6 on working days," he said. 8 hands to feed plus the family. If that is not what you were told, I apologize for the inconvenience." "It is not an inconvenience," she said. "It is a schedule." He glanced back at her, and for just an instant she thought she saw the corner of his mouth move in something that might, under more favorable conditions, have become a smile. Then he set down his mug on the table with a quiet, definitive sound and walked out. She stood alone in the kitchen in the early morning light, listening to his footsteps cross the yard, and thought to herself that Thea had been precisely right. He was not difficult. He was careful. And there was a significant difference between those two things. The weeks that followed were among the most physically demanding of Winifred's life, and also among the most satisfying. The Fenwick household was not unmanageable, but it had suffered from 18 months of improvised arrangements since Clara's death, and the accumulated disorder of a house, run by a grieving man with 3 children, and no system, was considerable. Winifred attacked it with the methodical energy of someone who has been waiting for years to have something genuinely worth organizing. She established a routine with the children that balanced their schooling, which she conducted in the front parlor for 3 hours each morning, with the outdoor time and physical freedom that 3 children growing up on a cattle ranch both needed and demanded. Margaret was sharp and eager and read 2 years above what Winifred had expected. Thomas was restless and impatient in the way of intelligent boys who have not yet found the subject that will hold them, and Winifred watched him carefully until she understood that what absorbed him most was anything mathematical, at which point she abandoned conventional methods and simply let him calculate everything that could be calculated on a working ranch, which turned out to be a great deal. Samuel continued to say very little and to stay close to her side, with the focused attachment of a small, extremely determined shadow. She settled into the rhythms of the place with a naturalness that surprised her. She had expected homesickness and found instead something that felt like the absence of a kind of low chronic pain she had lived with for so long she had stopped noticing it until it was gone. The St. Louis life had not been a bad one, only a constrained one, and the plain was wide and the air was clean, and the work was real, and the days passed with a purposeful velocity that she had not felt in years. Henry Hadley remained at a careful distance. He was courteous to her in the way a man is courteous to a woman he has no intention of knowing better, which is to say he was polite and impersonal and efficient in every exchange. He answered questions when she had them, which she took care to ask only when she genuinely needed an answer, and he thanked her for meals in the same tone he might have used to confirm that a gate was properly latched. He was, she observed without resentment, a man who had constructed a very effective distance between himself and whatever might reach him, and he maintained it with considerable skill. And yet, she noticed things she had not expected to notice. She noticed that he was the first one in the barn every morning and the last one out every night. She noticed that he had a way with horses that was closer to a conversation than a command, patient and quiet and deeply attentive, and that the horses responded to him with an absolute trust that spoke of something genuine rather than enforced. She noticed that the ranch hands respected him, not with the uneasy deference that comes from fear, but with the straightforward regard that comes from competence and fairness, and that he was quicker to praise than to criticize and quicker to take on a difficult task himself than to assign it to someone else. She noticed that he read, which she had not expected, a battered copy of something she could not identify that he kept in the inside pocket of his vest, and drew out during the brief midday rest, turning the pages with the same focused attention he gave to everything else. She noticed that on 2 occasions when Samuel had wandered in the direction of the corral and gotten closer to the horses than was safe for a 6-year-old, Henry had been there before Winifred, moving with a quiet, unhurried certainty, lifting the boy back from the fence rail and setting him down in a safer position without fuss or alarm, then crouching down to explain something about the horse that made Samuel's eyes go wide with interest. She noticed all of these things and told herself she was simply observant by nature, which was true, and did not constitute anything beyond professional attention to the household in her care. It was in the 6th week of her time at the ranch that the first thing happened that could not be filed under the heading of professional observation. There had been a storm the night before, one of the sudden violent Kansas thunderstorms that came up without warning from the south and made the entire plain feel like the inside of a drum. And in its aftermath, the creek that ran along the eastern edge of the property had risen sharply and washed out a section of fence. Henry had taken 2 of the hands to assess the damage and repair it, and Winifred had taken the children to gather herbs from the kitchen garden before the standing water could spoil the beds. She had sent the children back inside with their baskets and was alone at the edge of the garden when she found a young calf that had evidently been separated from its mother in the confusion of the storm and had worked its way through a gap in the nearby fence. It was standing in the remnants of the kitchen garden looking confused and very sorry for itself, and when she tried to herd it back toward the gap, it went in every direction except the one she intended. She was engaged in a considerable and entirely undignified struggle with the calf when she heard Henry's horse approaching, and looked up to find him watching her from the saddle with an expression she had never seen on his face before. He was fighting a smile. Not the polite, minimal movement she had noticed once before, but a genuine, helpless, involuntary smile of the kind that arrives before a person can prevent it. And he seemed to be aware of this because he looked away briefly before dismounting, which gave her the charitable impression that he was trying to preserve her dignity. He came around the fence with the ease of a man who had been dealing with stray calves his entire life, made a sound she could not quite reproduce, and the calf turned toward him as if it had been waiting for precisely this instruction, and walked itself meekly back through the gap. Henry set the fence rail back in place and turned to look at her, and the smile was still there, contained now but not quite gone, living in the corner of his mouth and in the crinkle at the edge of his dark eyes. "It requires a particular tone," he said. "Apparently," she said, and she was aware that her hat had gone sideways and her skirt was muddy at the hem and her dignity was approximately 3 counties to the west, and she did not, she realized, particularly mind. "You are not going to give up on it," he said, and it was not quite a question. "I never found a good reason to give up on something simply because it was inconvenient," she said. He looked at her with a directness that was different from his usual careful, impersonal regard, something more searching in it, as if he had heard something in her words that interested him in spite of himself. "No," he said quietly. "I suppose that is a reasonable way to live." Then he touched the brim of his hat and walked back to his horse, and she stood in the muddy kitchen garden and watched him go and thought that Thea, back in her general store with her copper hair and her good coffee, would have found this moment entirely satisfying. The summer deepened and the cattle drive preparations began in earnest, and the ranch shifted into a different register of activity, faster and more concentrated, the hands working longer hours. The energy of the place wound tighter with anticipation. Harold Fenwick was gone for days at a time, riding out to coordinate with neighboring ranchers and with the buyers at the railhead, and the running of the household fell more fully to Winifred, which she managed with growing confidence. She and Henry developed, without either of them formally acknowledging it, a kind of working relationship that went beyond their initial carefully maintained formality. It began practically, out of necessity. There were decisions to be made about the ranch household that required consultation, about supplies and schedules and the children's safety during the busy drive period, and it was simpler and more efficient to discuss these things together in the early mornings when the kitchen was quiet, over the strong coffee that had become a fixture of her days. These conversations began as purely functional and became, gradually and almost imperceptibly, something else. She discovered that he had grown up in West Texas, the son of a cattle rancher who had lost everything to drought when Henry was 15, and that he had been working other men's herds ever since, moving north with the drives and accumulating the particular kind of knowledge that only comes from doing a thing in every possible condition. He had come to the Fenwick Ranch with the intention of staying one season and discovered that he did not want to leave. "What kept you?" she asked one morning, watching the light change on the grass beyond the window. He was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee mug in his hands. "The children," he said finally. "When I arrived, Margaret was 9 and Thomas was 7 and Samuel was barely 4. Clara was still alive then." He paused. "They needed someone steady. Harold is a good man, but the drive season takes everything he has. I thought I would stay until things settled." "And then they did not," she said. "No," he said quietly. "They did not." She understood, in the way she understood most things that were not said directly, that he was talking about Clara's death and about the way grief disrupts a child's world at a fundamental level, and that he had stayed because leaving would have felt like another abandonment in a household that had already absorbed too many. "They are fortunate," she said, meaning it completely. He looked at her, and there was something in his expression that was not the closed, careful guardedness she had grown accustomed to, but something more open, something that looked, briefly, almost vulnerable. "They are better now," he said, "since you came." It was the first personal thing he had said to her directly, and the quiet sincerity of it moved her more than she had expected, more than she was quite prepared for. She kept her expression steady and said thank you, and changed the subject to the question of the children's lessons during the drive period. But for the rest of the morning she carried his words with her like something warm kept close under a coat. It was Margaret who said the thing out loud that no one else was saying. Margaret was 11 years old and had her father's quiet steadiness and her dead mother's observational precision, and she had been watching Winifred and Henry with the unsentimental attention of a child who has learned to read adults as a survival skill. She said it on an evening in late July when she and Winifred were sitting on the porch after supper, shelling beans in the long amber light, and she said it with the directness of someone who considers deliberate obtuseness a form of dishonesty. "Henry looks at you differently than he looks at anyone else," she said. Winifred considered her response carefully. "I think Mr. Hadley is simply a man who takes his responsibilities seriously," she said. Margaret gave her a look that was, for an 11-year-old, remarkably expressive of polite skepticism. "He sat outside in the rain last month to keep watch because you said you heard something moving near the henhouse," she said. "He has never done that for the henhouse before." Winifred had not known he had sat outside in the rain. She had assumed, after hearing nothing further, that whatever she had heard had been nothing of consequence. "I see," she said. "I am not saying it to cause discomfort," Margaret said with great seriousness. "I am saying it because I think it should be known. My mother used to say that the worst thing that happens between people is not difficulty, it is inattention. She said most things that should be said simply are not said, and then the moment passes." Winifred set down the beans she was holding and looked at this girl, this 11-year-old child who had lost her mother and had been carrying her observations around like a careful, tender responsibility she had not asked for, and she felt something ache in her chest. "Your mother was very wise," she said. "Yes," Margaret said simply. "She was." They sat in silence for a while after that, the beans accumulating in the bowl between them, the light deepening toward evening, and Winifred thought about inattention, and about moments, and about the things that people do not say until it is too late to say them. The following Saturday brought an unexpected occasion for something other than work. The town of Caldwell held its midsummer social in the main street, a tradition that drew people from ranches and homesteads across the surrounding area, with music and food and dancing that went on past dark. Harold Fenwick declared it a necessary break from the preparation tension, and that the entire household was going, including the hands who could be spared. Winifred wore the one good dress she had brought from St. Louis, a deep green that she had always thought did something useful for her coloring, and she spent considerable time on her hair, and then told herself firmly that she was doing so because one ought to look presentable at a social occasion, and for no other reason, and almost convinced herself. Henry was waiting with the wagon when they came out, the children scrubbed and restless with excitement, Samuel already trying to climb the wheel before anyone had helped him up. Henry caught him neatly under the arms and swung him up to the seat, and Samuel laughed, a clear, unguarded sound, and Henry smiled in response, and Winifred, watching from the porch, had the distinct sensation of her heart doing something unauthorized. He looked up then and saw her, and she saw him see her, and there was a moment, brief as a breath, in which his expression held something that was unmistakably more than casual. "Miss Talbot," he said. "Mr. Hadley," she said, and came down the porch steps. He offered his hand to help her up to the wagon with the same unhurried quiet that characterized every physical movement he made, and she took it, and was aware with every part of her of the warmth of his hand and the steadiness of his grip, and she looked forward and not at him as the wagon began to move, and was extremely glad she had taken trouble with her hair. The Caldwell Midsummer Social was a boisterous, generous, somewhat chaotic affair, and Winifred, who had spent years in St. Louis attending events that were carefully curated performances of respectability, found it deeply refreshing. There were long tables laden with food contributed by the surrounding households. There were children everywhere in states of considerable excitement, and from a small raised platform at the end of the street, a fiddle player and a banjo player produced music with an infectious energy that made standing still feel like a waste. Thea found her within minutes, because Thea was the kind of person who found people with purpose, and embraced her with the warmth of long friendship rather than the 8 weeks they had actually known each other. "You look beautiful," Thea said, holding her at arm's length. "And before you say something modest and deflecting, I am simply stating an observable fact." "You look wonderful yourself," Winifred said, and meant it. "Where is Henry Hadley?" Thea asked, with absolutely no pretense of subtlety. "He is likely attending to the horses," Winifred said, "and when he is no longer attending to the horses, then he will be attending to whatever he attends to at a social occasion," Winifred said firmly. Thea's expression conveyed volumes about what she thought of this response. There was dancing in the street as the afternoon moved toward evening, the kind of square dancing that requires a caller and makes up in collective enthusiasm what it lacks in individual grace. Winifred danced twice, first with Thomas, who was at the age of finding dancing mortifyingly embarrassing, and therefore needed to be dragged into it, and then could not be made to stop. And then with Harold Fenwick, who danced with the stiff, dutiful formality of a man who is doing something he considers socially obligatory rather than enjoyable, but who smiled genuinely when she made him laugh with an observation about Thomas's transformation from reluctant participant to enthusiast. She saw Henry across the gathering several times, once standing with two of the ranch hands at the edge of the food tables, once talking to a man she did not recognize with the focused attention of someone conducting genuine business even in a social context, and once standing alone at the far side of the crowd, watching the dancing with an expression she could not quite read from the distance. It was Thea who engineered what happened next, with the benevolent shamelessness of a woman who had decided the universe needed a small amount of assistance. She appeared at Winifred's side precisely as the fiddle player began a slower piece, took Winifred gently but firmly by the elbow, steered her in the direction of the man standing alone at the edge of the crowd, and then vanished with the self-satisfaction of someone who has done an excellent and entirely obvious thing. Henry turned when he heard her approach, and she saw the brief surprise in his expression before he composed it. "Miss Talbot," he said. "I believe," she said, with a directness that was something she had learned from Margaret and something that had always been her own, that the social convention at this type of occasion involves dancing. "And I have danced with a 9-year-old and your employer, which has been perfectly adequate, but I thought perhaps one should also make the attempt with someone who might be a more competent partner." He looked at her for a long, still moment, and she held his gaze and did not retreat from it, and then the corner of his mouth moved in the way she had begun to know. "I am a fair dancer," he said. "I will accept fair," she said. He danced better than fair. He danced with the same natural physical ease he brought to everything, unhurried and sure, and he held her with precisely the appropriate propriety and nothing more. But she was close enough to be fully and acutely aware of him, in the way she had been working very hard not to be aware of him for the past 6 weeks. The music was slow, and the evening light was the color of honey, and the street smelled of wood smoke and frying food and summer grass, and she thought that of all the places she had been, and all the things she had imagined for herself, none of them had looked anything like this, and she would not have traded it for any of them. "You said you never give up on a thing once you have decided it is worth fighting for," he said quietly. She looked up at him. "I did say that." "I have been thinking about it," he said. "Have you?" "I have been thinking about a number of things," he said, and the careful distance in his voice was gone, replaced by something lower and more honest. "About the fact that this ranch felt different after you came. About the fact that the children who have had a hard year are better. About the fact that you sat in the kitchen garden in the mud arguing with a calf for 20 minutes because you were not going to let it defeat you." She laughed despite herself, and he smiled, a full real smile this time, and she thought she had never seen anything quite so worth seeing in her life. "I did not know you sat outside in the rain," she said, "because of the hen house." Something moved in his expression. "Margaret told you. Margaret is observant. Margaret takes after her mother," he said, and the brief shadow that moved through his eyes at the mention of Clara was something she understood and did not push against. "She told me something her mother said," Winifred said, "about inattention and about moments passing." He was quiet for a beat, and they moved with the music, and the light continued its slow, golden descent. "Winifred," he said, and her name in his voice, her actual name rather than Miss Talbot, was something that reached her below the level of reasoning, somewhere more fundamental than thought. "Yes," she said. "I am a careful man," he said. "I have been careful for a long time for reasons that seemed sufficient. I am not sure they are as sufficient as I thought." "I am not asking you to be less careful," she said honestly. "I am asking you to be careful in a direction you may not have considered." He looked at her and she looked at him, and the music played and the evening light lay over the street like something that had been given rather than earned. And he said, quietly, "May I call on you?" "Properly, when we are back at the ranch." "You may," she said. And that was the beginning of the second, more complicated, more important thing. He began to call on her in the evenings when the day's work was done, sitting with her on the porch in the cooling air, talking with a gradually increasing openness that she recognized as something he was practicing, as a man practices a skill he has let atrophy, not without effort but with genuine intent. He told her about Texas, and about his father, and about the years of driving cattle up through Indian Territory, and about the particular quality of silence on the open plain at night that he had never managed to put into adequate words, but that she understood immediately when he tried. She told him about St. Louis and about her aunt, and about the 17 readings of the advertisement, and about the specific quality of the life she had left, the careful embroidery and the careful words, and the accumulated weight of carefully arranged disappointments. She had not told anyone else about the 17 readings. She had not expected to tell him but found it emerging naturally, the way things do when the person you are talking to is listening with their whole attention and not merely waiting for their turn. "You were brave," he said. "I was desperate," she said honestly. "Those are not mutually exclusive," he said. She thought about that. "No," she agreed. "I suppose they are not." He took her hand one evening at the end of the second week of calling on her, at the conclusion of a long conversation about nothing in particular that had felt in retrospect like the most important conversation she had ever had, and he held it with the same sure, quiet care that characterized everything he did. And she turned her hand in his, and felt the roughness of working hands and the warmth of them, and thought that she could have counted the number of times in her life that she had felt this completely settled in a moment on one hand, and had fingers left over. The cattle drive departed in the first week of August. It was a significant undertaking. The full trail crew of 15 men driving over 400 head north through Kansas toward the railhead, with Harold Fenwick at the head of it and Henry as trail boss. They would be gone for the better part of 3 weeks, possibly longer depending on conditions, and the morning of their departure was charged with a particular kind of energy, purposeful and focused, and tinged with the awareness that trail driving in 1879 carried real risks. Henry came to find her before the drive left, when the hands were making final preparations, and the cattle were already being moved to the trail. He found her at the edge of the garden, and she had the sense that he had looked for her specifically there, as if it had become the place where things of consequence were said between them. He stood with his hat in his hands, which she had never seen him do before, and she thought it was possibly the most revealing gesture she had ever seen him make. 3 weeks, he said. "Or possibly longer," she said. "I do not want to leave things unclear," he said, with the direct simplicity of a man who has spent considerable time deciding on words and then used the plainest ones available. "Before I go." "Then do not," she said. "I am in love with you," he said. "I have been trying not to be for approximately 6 weeks, and I have been entirely unsuccessful." The plain stretched around them in every direction under the August sky, enormous and luminous and indifferent, and the wind moved through the grass with its page-turning sound, and she felt something in her chest open like a door that has been stuck for years suddenly swinging free. 6 weeks, she said. "I believe my timeline was slightly shorter." Something flickered in his eyes. "How short?" "The kitchen," she said. "The morning I arrived, you were at the back door with your coffee." He was quiet for a moment. "That was the first morning," he said. "Yes," she said, "I am aware." "Winifred," he said, in the voice that used her name like it was a thing of value. "I love you as well, Henry," she said. "Please go drive your cattle north and come back to me." He closed the small distance between them and took her face gently in both his working man's hands and kissed her. And it was the kind of kiss that is not urgent or demanding, but is absolutely certain, the kind that carries in it the particular weight of everything that came before and the clear promise of everything that comes after. She kissed him back with equal certainty, and felt the August heat and the wind and the smell of grass and cattle and leather and the warmth of his hands, and thought that her aunt in St. Louis would not have believed this was the same woman who had embroidered careful flowers in a quiet room. He rode out an hour later at the head of the drive, and he turned once in the saddle to look back, and she raised her hand, and he touched the brim of his hat in return, and then the dust took them and they were gone. The 3 weeks that followed were busy enough that she did not have time to do anything as indulgent as simply missing him, though she did that as well, in the margins of the days. The children kept her occupied thoroughly. Thomas had reached a new stage of mathematical fascination that required constant feeding. Margaret had decided to attempt a serious piece of writing and needed an audience for each developing draft. Samuel had begun to talk more, a change so gradual and so significant that she had to be careful not to make too much of it and frighten him back into silence. And she spent considerable time simply being in the same place as him and letting the conversation come when it chose. She wrote letters in the evenings, because she had developed the habit of writing to her aunt despite the difficult nature of their relationship, and because Thea had become in 8 weeks the closest friend she had made since school. She wrote to Thea about Henry, which she had not precisely done before, and Thea's return letter, which arrived with impressive speed for the Kansas Postal Service, contained 3 sentences about how she had seen this coming from the first afternoon over coffee, and one extremely well-aimed observation about how the best things are almost never the things you planned, which Winifred reread several times. A difficulty arose in the 2nd week that was not connected to cattle or love, but to a man named Warren Crail. Crail was a rancher from a property to the west, a man Winifred had seen twice in passing without forming any strong impression beyond a general sense of presumption, and he arrived at the Fenwick Ranch on a Tuesday afternoon with 2 of his men and a manner that made Winifred's spine stiffen before he had dismounted. He said he had come to discuss a land matter with Harold Fenwick, which was plainly not true given that he was perfectly aware Harold was on the drive, and when Winifred told him as much, he spent a period of time that was slightly too long looking at her in a way that she recognized and disliked completely, the particular way of a man who looks at a woman as if she is an arrangement of furniture whose position might be advantageously altered. "You are managing the property while Harold is away." He said, "I am the housekeeper," she said, in a tone that made the title sound precisely as authoritative as she intended, "and I am managing the household." Any business matters would need to wait for Mr. Fenwick's return. Crail smiled in a way that was not warm. "A capable woman," he said. "Hard to find in this country." "Harder to find than you might hope," she agreed pleasantly. "Good afternoon, Mr. Crail." He left, but he came back 2 days later, and then once more at the end of the week, each time with reasons that did not withstand examination. On the 3rd visit, he said something to Winifred about the difficulty of a woman managing alone, with a particular emphasis on the word alone that she understood clearly. She informed him with complete composure that she was not alone, that there were 6 ranch hands on the property at any given time, that the trail crew was expected back within the week, and that Harold Fenwick employed a foreman who took a particular professional interest in the security of the ranch and its people. She used Henry's name without ornamentation or apology and watched Crail's expression register this and recalibrate. He did not come back after that. She told Henry about it when he returned, not because she had been frightened, she had not been, but because she had decided on the night of Crail's 3rd visit that there would be no significant omissions between her and Henry if she had any power to prevent it, and that sharing the inconvenient things as well as the pleasant ones was part of what she meant by loving someone. Henry listened to all of it without interrupting, standing in the kitchen on the evening of his return, still dusty from the trail, and she watched his jaw tighten fractionally at Crail's name and relax again as she finished. "He did not frighten you," he said. "No," she said. "He irritated me considerably." "What did you say to him?" she told him, and she saw the look in his eyes when she mentioned using his name, something that moved through his expression quickly and settled into warmth. "I will pay a call on Crail," he said quietly. "That is not necessary," she said. "I know it is not necessary," he said. "I would like to do it anyway." She looked at him. "I handled it," she said. Yes, he agreed fully and without qualification. You did. I would still like to speak to him. Why? She asked. He was quiet a moment. Because there are things I said to you before I left that I meant entirely, he said. And because the implications of meaning them include certain responsibilities that I am not going to pretend otherwise about. She stood in the kitchen and looked at this man, dusty and tired from 3 weeks on the trail, who was standing in her kitchen at the end of a long, hard day and saying plainly and without embellishment that he considered himself responsible for her, not because she needed him to be, but because he had chosen to be, and she thought that of all the things she had discovered in Kansas, this was the most extraordinary. "Henry," she said. "Yes," he said. "Would you sit down for a moment?" she said. "You have been on a horse for 3 weeks." He sat, and she poured coffee, and they sat at the kitchen table in the evening quiet, and he told her about the drive, and she told him about the children and about Samuel's new sentences. And by the time the kitchen was dark and the stars were coming out, they had moved from the table to the porch, and his hand was in hers, and neither of them was saying anything at all, which was, she thought, its own kind of language. The autumn came to the Kansas plain like a letter from somewhere colder and more serious, the grass going gold and then pale, the mornings arriving with a chill that made the coffee taste even better, the sky settling into the deep clear blue that seems available only in fall. The cattle drive was done, and the money was settled, and Harold Fenwick had paid his hands their wages, and there was a satisfaction over the entire ranch of a season's hard work completed. Harold asked to speak with Henry and then with Winifred, separately, on the same afternoon in early October. She did not know what he said to Henry, but when Harold spoke to her in his study, it was with the quiet directness she had come to associate with him. "Henry Hadley is the best man I have ever employed," Harold said, "and he has been since the death of my wife, a steadying presence on this ranch that I could not have managed without. I believe his feelings for you are entirely serious." "I believe they are," Winifred said, "and yours for him." "Equally so," she said. Harold nodded, in the manner of a man confirming something he had already understood. "I want you to know," he said, "that whatever arrangement you and Henry arrive at, my hope is that you will both continue to be part of this ranch and these children's lives. I am not speaking as your employer. I am speaking as someone who has seen what your presence here has done for 3 children who needed something that I could not entirely give them alone. I have no intention of going anywhere," she said, and felt the truth of it completely. Henry asked her to marry him on an evening in late October, which she would later think was the most characteristically Henry approach possible, because it was not a surprise in the theatrical sense, but an honest declaration with all the impulsiveness of a man who had thought about it for a very long time and had decided with perfect clarity. He had taken her out to the edge of the east pasture at sunset, which had become something they did together when the day allowed, because the view from that edge in the evening light was the most beautiful thing Winifred had ever regularly seen in her life. The grass and the sky, and the particular color of the horizon at that hour, which was not quite orange and not quite red, and was something she had tried to describe in letters to Thea, and failed every time. He stood beside her in the evening light and he said, "I have been thinking." "I know," she said. "You know," he repeated. "You have a particular expression when you have been thinking about something with some significance," she said. "You have been wearing it for 3 days." He looked at her sidelong, and she saw the warm, complicated thing in his eyes that she had begun to think of as hers, as the look that was specifically for her, and that she had not seen directed at anyone else. "Winifred," he said, "I would like to spend my life on this plain. I know that is not what everyone would choose, and I know that you came here from a different kind of world, and I would not ask you to stay somewhere you did not choose entirely freely." "I choose this," she said clearly. "I would like to spend my life on this plain with you," he said. "I would like to marry you, if you will have me, and build something here that belongs to both of us." The sun was going below the horizon, and the light was doing the impossible thing it did in those last minutes, spreading across the grass in a warm lateral illumination that made everything visible and specific and deeply, precisely real. She looked at this man, this careful and decent and deeply capable man who had let her reach him, who had crossed the careful distance he had kept so well, who had sat outside in the rain because she said she heard something near the hen house, who had held Samuel under the arms and set him down safely, and then crouched in the dirt to tell him something about horses, who had kissed her in the garden before riding out on the drive with the sureness of a man who knows his own heart completely. "I will have you," she said, "entirely and without reservation." He took her in his arms then, and held her in the way he did everything, with complete and unhurried certainty, and she stood in the fading light with her face against his chest and the wind moving through the grass around them, and felt the full weight of her life shifting into a shape she had not known to imagine for itself, but that fit her, she discovered, in every particular. They were married in November, in the Caldwell church, on a day that was cold and clear with a sky the color of a winter sea. Thea stood up with Winifred and declared her duties, as witness executed with extraordinary personal satisfaction. Harold Fenwick stood up with Henry, and the three children were seated in the front pew in their best clothing, Thomas fidgeting, Margaret composed, Samuel sitting very still with his small hands folded in his lap, watching Winifred come down the aisle with an expression of total attentive gravity. The ceremony was simple, and the words were clear, and Winifred said them looking directly at Henry, and he said them looking directly at her. And when it was done, and the minister had made his declaration, and Henry kissed her in the sight of everyone present, she heard Samuel make a small sound from the front pew that was unmistakably and unself-consciously happy, and she thought that she would remember that sound for the rest of her life. The wedding supper was held at the Fenwick Ranch, because Thea organized it, and Thea had strong opinions about location, and had decided that the ranch was the correct place. And it was a warm and generous evening with good food and the fiddle player from the midsummer social playing in the corner, and a fire going against the November cold. Henry danced with her twice and with Margaret once and lifted Samuel onto his back for a brief circuit of the room that Samuel found deeply satisfying. And Harold Fenwick made a toast that was brief and sincere, and made Winifred's eyes sting in a way she was not going to apologize for. At the end of the evening, when the guests had gone and the children were in bed and Harold had retired and the fire was burning low, Henry and Winifred sat alone in the kitchen, as they had sat so many times in the mornings of their courtship, and drank coffee and were married and were very happy. "I have been thinking," she said. He looked at her with warm amusement. "I know," he said. "You have a particular expression." She laughed and he laughed, and the fire crackled, and the November wind moved around the house outside, and she thought that of all the places she had been, all the careful rooms of her previous life, and all the careful arrangements of it, nothing had prepared her for this particular happiness, which was not careful at all but was wide and open and built for the long weather. The winter was a working season on the ranch, less intense than the drive months but full of its own labor, the maintenance of fences and buildings, the tending of stock through the cold, the planning for the spring. Henry took on more responsibility as Harold increasingly trusted his judgment on the larger questions of ranch management, and Winifred continued the children's schooling through the short gray days and managed the household with the settled competence of someone who has found the exact shape of work that fits them. She and Henry had been given the foreman's cottage, a small house on the ranch property perhaps 50 yards from the main house, which had been empty since the previous foreman departed, and which Winifred had been observing with a professional eye since her arrival. They moved into it after the wedding, and she spent several weeks of the winter making it their own, not in any grand sense, but in the accumulating domestic way of two people who have decided to share a space and go about the business of making it genuinely theirs. Henry built shelves. She made curtains. He repaired the fireplace flue that had been drawing poorly. She filled the shelves with books, a combination of her own collection and a careful selection from the Caldwell General Store's modest stock. And he would come in from the cold in the evenings and sit by the fire and take out his battered book and read, and she would read beside him, and it was, she thought, the most fundamentally peaceful thing she had ever experienced. She told him about the child in February. She had suspected for several weeks and had confirmed her suspicion with Thea, who had a practical knowledge of such matters that was not precisely medical, but was both more accurate and considerably more comfortable than consulting the doctor would have been. She told him in the evening, after supper, sitting by the fire, and she watched his face as she said the words and saw in it the complete journey from surprise to understanding to something so purely and openly joyful that it made her feel everything she was feeling at double the intensity. He crossed the room in 2 steps and knelt in front of her and took her hands and held them and looked at her in the firelight and said, "Winifred." Just that, just her name, but in his voice it contained everything necessary. "Yes," she said. "Are you well?" he said. "Are you feeling well?" "I am feeling remarkable," she said honestly, and it was true. He raised her hands to his lips and held them there a moment, and she watched the firelight move on his face, and thought that she could have, if asked, described every line of it from memory, had known it since that first morning when he was standing at the back door with his coffee, and the early light was doing something particular to the Kansas plain. He told Harold the next morning, and Harold's handshake was warm and genuine, and Margaret, who had apparently deduced the situation independently, came to find Winifred privately and said, with enormous composure, "I would like to help when the time comes, with anything that is needed." Thomas was informed by his sister and responded by immediately calculating how many months remained, which he found satisfying. Samuel climbed into Winifred's lap that afternoon and stayed there for the better part of an hour and said nothing at all, but she felt his small warmth against her and understood completely. The spring of 1880 came in with high spirits and strong wind, and the return of the cattle drives, and the returning energy of the Caldwell area. Ranches and homesteads waking from the winter quiet with the particular purposeful bustle of people who have a season's work to accomplish. Winifred, who was managing pregnancy with the same practical directness she brought to everything, continued teaching the children and running the household and writing long letters to Thea and to her aunt in St. Louis, who had responded to the news of her marriage with a letter that was stiff in places and warm in others, and which Winifred had read with the patient comprehension of a woman who has come to understand that some people express love at an angle rather than directly. She and Henry rode out together when she was able, which was most days through the early months, because the plain in spring was something that she could not keep herself from, the grass returning with a new green that seemed almost aggressive in its determination, the meadowlarks back and singing from every fence post, the sky doing things with clouds that were purely cinematic, and for which she had run completely out of metaphors. "You are staring at the clouds again," he said one afternoon, reining his horse alongside hers. "I am always staring at the clouds," she said. "They are extraordinary. Every day you see them," he said. "Every day they are extraordinary," she said. "I do not see why repetition should diminish the fact." He looked at her with the full, settled warmth of a man who is exactly where he intends to be, and she looked back, and the meadowlarks went on singing in the spring afternoon, and the world was, in all directions, immeasurably good. There came, in the middle of June, a complication. A man arrived at the Caldwell land office claiming ownership of a portion of the range that the Fenwick Ranch had been using for grazing under a long-standing informal arrangement with the previous owner of the land, a man named Garrett who had sold and moved east the previous year. The new claimant was a land agent from back east named Purcell who had purchased the parcel as an investment and had decided, having hired a lawyer and consulted his interests, that the informal arrangement was worth rather less than what he might collect in formal grazing fees from Harold Fenwick. Harold was calm about it, which Winifred respected, and Henry was methodical, which she had expected, and the matter required several trips to town and a good deal of documentation, and the involvement of a lawyer from Wichita who charged fees that made Harold's expression tighten briefly before he composed it. But the arrangement was eventually formalized in legal terms, at a cost that was not negligible but was manageable, and the range remained accessible, and Purcell received his grazing fee and presumably was satisfied in his investment calculations. It was not a dramatic crisis, only a complicated inconvenience, but it was the first significant difficulty she had navigated alongside Henry in the fully partnered sense, and what she observed during those 3 weeks of paperwork and town visits and legal correspondence was this. He did not make a single decision of consequence without consulting her, not because she had demanded this, but because it appeared simply not to occur to him to proceed otherwise. He sat across from her at the kitchen table in the evenings with the documents and the legal opinions, and explained what they said and asked what she thought, and listened to her answers with the same focused attention he brought to everything, and she contributed several observations that proved useful, and when the matter was resolved he said simply, "I am grateful you were here for this," and she understood that he meant something more than the specific situation. "I am always here for this," she said. That was the arrangement. "Yes," he said, and smiled at her in the particular private way that was only for her. The baby was born at the end of July, in the small hours of a hot Kansas night, in the cottage with the good fire and the shelves of books and the curtains she had made, with Thea present and Harold's housekeeper, and a doctor from town who arrived in time to be officially useful, and was in practice largely observational because Thea had everything in hand. It was a boy. Henry was in the room when his son was born, because she had wanted him there and had said so plainly, and he had not considered any argument against it for even a moment. He sat beside her and held her hand through the long, difficult night with the complete, unwavering steadiness that was so entirely him. And when the doctor announced a boy, and the baby announced himself to everyone in the vicinity at full volume, Henry made a sound that was very quiet and wholly unguarded, and she turned her head to look at him and saw, on his face, an openness she had only seen in unguarded moments, all the careful distance gone entirely, nothing left but pure feeling. Clear and deep and entirely unprotected. "Hello," he said softly to the small, furious person placed into his arms, and the baby stopped crying immediately, which Winifred considered the most extraordinary thing she had witnessed in a night of extraordinary things, and looked up with the unfocused attentiveness of the very newly arrived. "He likes your voice," she said. "He has heard it before," Henry said, which was the most purely tender thing she had ever heard him say. They named him James, for Henry's father, with Harold's middle name as a second name, which Harold received with the quiet emotion of a man not accustomed to being moved and very clearly moved. The children came to see him the following morning, Thomas announcing with great statistical confidence that James was a particularly good size for a newborn, Margaret sitting carefully beside Winifred with the baby in her arms looking precisely, as she looked when she was memorizing something she wanted to keep forever, and Samuel approaching the edge of the bed, and looking at his new small neighbor with enormous dark eyes for a very long time before reaching out one careful finger and touching the baby's hand. And the baby closed his fingers around Samuel's, and Samuel looked up at Winifred with an expression that she felt in the deepest part of herself. "He knows me," Samuel said quietly but with enormous certainty. "Yes," she said, "he does." The summer passed into another autumn, and the ranch moved through its rhythms, and James grew with the impatient energy of a boy who had places to be, rolling and reaching, and eventually, at 9 months old, pulling himself upright against the leg of the kitchen table, and standing with the furious concentration of someone achieving a summit, and looking around with enormous satisfaction at the conquered height of 14 inches. Henry was there for that first standing, because Winifred had called him in from the yard with the specific urgency of someone who knows a moment is happening and cannot be postponed. He came through the kitchen door and saw his son standing at the table leg and crouched down in one smooth motion to James's level, and watched him with a smile that was entirely helpless and entirely wonderful. And James, upon registering his father at eye level, let go of the table leg entirely in his enthusiasm and sat down hard on the kitchen floor and looked surprised, and then laughed, and Henry laughed. And Winifred stood in the kitchen doorway and felt the full, warm, specific weight of her life, and thought that her aunt in St. Louis was going to need a very long letter. The letter she eventually wrote was honest about all of it, the wide plain and the hard work and the complicated small-town economies of the West, and the genuine ongoing injustices she witnessed between those who had come and claimed the land and those who had lived there long before any claim was possible. The indigenous peoples whose displacement was present in the changed landscape and in the conversations of the older settlers, and in the careful way Winifred had begun to think about what belonging to a land truly meant as opposed to simply possessing a deed to it. She wrote about these things because she could not write honestly about her life without including them, because they were part of the world she inhabited, and ignoring them would have been a form of the same careful avoidance she had left St. Louis to escape. Her aunt replied to this portion of the letter with the particular silence of someone who does not disagree, but is also not ready to agree, and Winifred accepted this and continued writing. In the spring of 1881, Harold Fenwick made an offer to Henry that had been clearly coming for some time, and that Henry discussed with Winifred for 3 evenings before giving his answer. Harold, who was considering the future shape of his operation, proposed to make Henry a partner, a formal arrangement, legally documented, in which Henry would hold a stake in the Fenwick Ranch commensurate with his years of work and his ongoing role in its management. It was a generous offer and a recognition of what Henry had contributed, and it had been preceded by a long, honest conversation about what the ranch owed Henry that Harold had clearly been working up to for some time. Henry came home the first evening and told her about it and sat with his coffee and was quiet for a long time, which she respected by not filling. "What is your hesitation?" she asked eventually. He turned the mug in his hands. "I came here as a working cowboy," he said. "The trail and the drives and the day work, that is what I know. Being a partner in a ranching operation is a different thing." "You have been doing a different thing for 4 years," she said. "Yes," he said, "but there is a difference between being trusted with a thing and being offered a portion of it." "Is there?" she said. He looked at her. "You have earned it," she said, "not as a gift, as what is owed." "Harold does not owe me," he said. "He disagrees," she said, "and frankly I agree with Harold." He was quiet again. "If I accept," he said slowly, "this becomes a different kind of life." "Henry," she said, "we have a son who is 10 months old and standing up in the kitchen. This is already a different kind of life." He looked at her for a long, still moment, and then the smile came, the full one, the one that was hers, and he set down the mug and reached across the table and took her hand. "You are extremely persuasive," he said. "I have been told my most considerable liability is that I refuse to give up on things I believe are worth fighting for," she said. "Whoever told you that," he said, "was describing an extraordinary quality and calling it a liability, which says more about them than about you." She looked at him across the table in the lamplight of their small house on the Kansas plain, and thought that she would like, very much, to grow old with this man. "Accept the offer, Henry," she said. He accepted it. The formal documentation was completed in early April, and the partnership announcement was made first to the ranch hands and then, rather more festively, at a gathering that Thea organized on the occasion, because Thea organized all gatherings of consequence and considered this one to qualify. There was food and the fiddle player again, and Winifred danced with Henry, and then with Harold, and then with Thomas, who had at 11 years old developed genuine dance competence and would not admit to being pleased about it. and Henry held James against his chest for the slow dances, and James fell asleep against his shoulder with the total trustful abandonment of the very young. And the evening was warm, and the stars were extraordinary. Thea pulled Winifred aside at one point in the evening with the purposeful maneuvering of someone who has something to say that requires a slight degree of privacy, and Winifred followed her to the edge of the gathering with the amused resignation of someone who has known Thea long enough to understand that resistance is rarely effective. "I am getting married," Thea said. "Thea," Winifred said, with genuine delight. "Who?" "Daniel Ferris," Thea said, with the particular combination of confidence and radiance of a woman who has arrived at a decision she has been considering from multiple angles and found it entirely good from all of them. "The hardware man." "I know Daniel Ferris," Winifred said. "He is a good man." "He is an excellent man," Thea said, with considerable feeling. "He has been asking me for 8 months, and I have been practical about it for 8 months, and last Thursday I decided that practicality had been given sufficient opportunity to make its objections, and it had not produced any that outweighed the primary evidence." Winifred embraced her with the warmth of real affection and real happiness, and Thea held on tight, and over Thea's shoulder Winifred could see Henry across the gathering, still holding James against his chest, talking to Harold with the easy confidence of a man who had found the full shape of who he was and was comfortable in every dimension of it. She thought about St. Louis and the careful rooms and the 17 readings of an advertisement in a newspaper and the long bone-rattling stagecoach ride, and the moment she had stepped down onto the Caldwell street in the red dust and the afternoon heat, and thought she had made either the bravest or the most foolish decision of her life. She knew now, with the complete quiet certainty that only comes when a thing has had time to prove itself entirely, which it had been. The years that followed on the Fenwick Ranch had the texture of lives well lived, which is to say they were full and varied and occasionally difficult and frequently beautiful, and never, not once, anything like the careful, embroidered existence she had left behind. The partnership between Henry and Harold grew into something deeply functional and mutually trusting, the two men complementing each other in the way that two people with different strengths and shared values often do. Harold's broad strategic patience balanced by Henry's practical precision, both of them increasingly turning to Winifred for the kind of clear-eyed perspective that comes from someone who cares about the outcome, but is not personally invested in being right about the approach. James grew into a boy of extraordinary energy and considerable opinions, with his father's dark eyes and his mother's refusal to accept no as a final answer on subjects he considered still open for discussion. He followed Henry around the ranch with the focused devotion of a small apprentice, learning the names of things and the ways of things and the particular language of cattle and horses that Henry carried in him like a native tongue. The children, Harold's children, grew as children do. Margaret became at 13 a person of serious intellectual ambition and wrote letters to a school in Kansas City about the possibilities of formal education, and Winifred helped her with every draft and advocated loudly to Harold that his daughter's intelligence was an asset that deserved investment, not a complication to be managed. Harold listened, as Harold increasingly listened to Winifred on matters of this kind, and Margaret went east the following year to school with a trunk full of books and an expression of pure purposeful determination that made Winifred's heart ache with something between pride and recognition. Thomas found his subject at last, at 12 years old, in the form of the railroad engineering that was reaching across the Kansas territory, the mathematics of grade and span, and load that combined everything he loved into a single object of fascination. He would go on to study in Topeka and to build things that carried people and goods across the plains, but that was later. For now he was 12 and calculating the grade ratios of every hill within riding distance, which everyone found mildly exhausting, and which Henry encouraged with complete patience, because he recognized in Thomas the same quality he had in himself, the need to understand something completely by working through it rather than being told. Samuel turned 8, then 9, then 10, and became by degrees a quiet-spoken boy of extraordinary observational sensitivity, who could identify bird calls and red weather, and move through the natural world with a stillness that seemed to be native to him rather than learned. He and Henry had a particular understanding that did not require many words, the two of them capable of working alongside each other for hours in the comfortable silence of people who have understood each other for a long time. Winifred had a second child in the summer of 1882, a girl this time, born in the same cottage with the same shelves of books, with Thea present and with Henry beside her, and they named her Clara, for Harold's wife, which Harold received with the same quiet emotion with which he received all the important things, turning away briefly to compose himself before turning back with the clear, direct regard of a man who has decided to feel what he feels without apology. Clara was born with an immediate and comprehensive interest in everything that moved, and spent the first years of her life attempting to follow James with a determination that significantly exceeded her physical capacity, falling over and getting up and going again with a cheerful persistence that Henry said, watching her one afternoon from the porch, reminded him of someone he knew. Who? Winifred asked, though she was fairly certain she knew. A woman who argued with a calf in a muddy garden for 20 minutes, he said. She leaned against his shoulder and looked out at the plain in the afternoon light, the same plain she had looked at on the first day and every day since, the grass and the enormous sky and the horizon that she had tried to describe in letters and could not. And she thought that all the words she had were still not quite enough for this particular thing, and that this was all right, because some things are meant to be lived rather than described. It was the spring of 1883 when the thing happened that she had not expected, but that, in retrospect, seemed to have been quietly building for a long time. She was in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning when a letter arrived, forwarded through 3 hands from St. Louis, and she recognized her aunt's handwriting on the envelope and opened it with the practiced ease of someone who has read many such letters and knows the particular geography of their author's correspondence. Her aunt was dying. Not suddenly, not from accident, but from the long, slow illness that had been following her for several years, and that had now, apparently, decided to conclude its approach. The letter was not dramatic. It was not that kind of letter. It was instead the kind of letter a certain type of person writes when they have decided to be honest about something while there is still time to be honest about it, careful and precise and containing, in its 5th paragraph, these words: "I was wrong to make your departure difficult. I understand now, reading your letters, that you found what I was never willing to look for, and I am glad of it. That is not something I would have said a year ago. It is what I mean to say now." She sat at the kitchen table with the letter for a long time. Henry came in at mid-morning and found her there and sat down across from her without speaking until she had told him, and then he was quiet for a moment and took her hand across the table. "Go to her," he said. "The children," she said. "The ranch. The children will be here when you return. The ranch will be here. Thea will come and stay." He paused. "She wrote you what she should have said before. You should give her the chance to say the rest of it in person." She looked at him and thought about the things that are not said, and the moments that pass, and about inattention, and about Clara Fenwick's wisdom delivered through her 11-year-old daughter on a porch with a bowl of beans between them. "I will be gone 3 weeks," she said. "I will be here when you come back," he said. She made the trip in May, the journey back east that was so different from the journey west she had made 4 years earlier, different not only in direction but in the quality of her whole self. She was not the same woman who had stepped off the stagecoach in Caldwell with 2 leather trunks and a bone-handled knife set, and a quiet desperation. She was a woman with a husband who loved her completely, and who she loved in equal and exact return, with a son and a daughter and 3 children who were not hers by blood, and entirely hers in every way that mattered, with a home on the wide Kansas plain and work that was real and a friendship with Thea that was one of the best things in her life. And she carried all of this with her on the eastward journey like ballast, like the weight that keeps a ship from turning over. Her aunt was thinner and slower and looked, in certain lights, like a woman who had been carrying something heavy for too long and was ready to set it down. They spent 2 weeks in the quiet house in St. Louis, talking in the way they had not talked before, without the careful arrangements and the words held back. And Winifred's aunt said the things she had not said, and Winifred received them, and said the things she had been carrying in return, and the space between them, which had been structured around absence for so long, became structured instead around what was actually there. On the last evening, sitting together in the parlor where Winifred had done her careful embroidery in her previous life, her aunt said, "Tell me about him again. Your Henry." And Winifred told her, and her aunt listened with closed eyes and a small quiet smile, and said at the end, "Good. That is good." Her aunt died in September of that year peacefully, and Winifred received the news on the Kansas plain and cried the particular cry that comes from grief mixed with gratitude, because she had been there in May and the important things had been said, and nothing of significance had been left unspoken. Henry held her and said nothing, which was exactly right, and James climbed into her lap without being asked, which was also exactly right, and Clara, not quite 1 year old, reached up and patted Winifred's face with an authority that was so purely her daughter's that it made Winifred laugh through her tears, which was perhaps the most exactly right thing of all. The Fenwick Ranch continued to grow through the mid-1880s, not in the speculative, reckless way of some operations that overstretched in those years and collapsed when the bad winters came, but steadily and carefully, with the methodical patience of men who understood that a thing built to last required different decisions than a thing built to grow quickly. Henry and Harold made those decisions with the disciplined conservatism of people who were working for the long term, and when the terrible winter of 1886 and 1887 came and devastated ranching operations across the plains, the Fenwick Ranch lost cattle but did not lose the ranch, which was not true for all of their neighbors. That winter was hard in ways that went beyond the financial. The cattle that died were a loss, yes, but the loss of neighbors was harder. The families who had built their lives on homesteads and claims that the brutal weather undid in weeks, people Winifred had come to know and care about, who had to make the terrible calculation of whether to stay and rebuild or to accept defeat and go elsewhere. She and Thea organized relief efforts through the most severe period, gathering food and supplies and organizing the practical assistance of the town and the surrounding ranches for the families who needed it most. And Winifred worked at this with the same refusal to accept limitation as a final state that characterized everything she did. Henry worked alongside her in all of it, contributing without being asked to both the material support and the harder work of being present for people in a sustained and useful way. And she watched him and thought, not for the first time, that the people who had called him careful had been using a word that was too small. The hard winter eventually ended, as winters do. The ranch rebuilt. The plain came back green. The cattle drives resumed, and the sounds and smells of the Kishom Trail in its later years, already beginning to feel different as the railroads pushed further south and changed the geography of the cattle trade, moved through the Caldwell area with the familiar rhythm of something that was both entirely present and already, in some important sense, beginning to be history. James turned 7 and began to ride seriously, with the natural ease of a boy who has grown up with horses and understands them the way Henry understands them. And Henry taught him in the same patient, methodical way he did everything, without urgency or performance, simply by being beside him and letting the learning happen at its own pace. Winifred watched the two of them in the corral one afternoon, the tall man and the small boy working a young horse with identical focused quiet, and felt something so deep and complete that she stood at the corral fence for a long time without moving, just watching, just holding it. Clara, at 3, was what her father described privately as a force of nature, which was the most accurate description available. She was opinionated and fearless and affectionate in the complete physical way of children who are entirely secure in their welcome. And she had her father's dark eyes and her mother's habit of reading everything she could get her hands on and her entirely own absolute conviction that whatever she wanted to do was both possible and a good idea. She followed James with increasing success and had opinions about horses and about the kitchen garden and about the best approach to everything, which she expressed without any apparent concern for whether the people around her found this overwhelming, which they did not, because she was 3 and the opinions were mostly charming. Samuel, who was 14 and in the serious searching phase of that age, had begun to correspond with a naturalist in Topeka about the birds and plants of the Kansas plain, and Winifred supported this with books and postage, and the particular quality of attention that recognizes a genuine calling when it presents itself. Harold, who was both Samuel's father and an increasingly thoughtful observer of his children's needs, had the conversation with his youngest son about the future that Winifred had been gently encouraging for months, and Samuel's face during that conversation, the careful, serious recognition of being truly seen by his father, was something she was glad to have witnessed. In the autumn of 1888, Henry came home in the evening with the look she knew, the particular quality of deliberate consideration that meant something was being worked through. They sat on the porch after supper, as they had sat on porches together for 9 years by now, and the stars came out over the plain in the specific way they had in Kansas, not emerging gradually as they did in more eastern skies but appearing fully and all at once, as if the sky had been waiting for the light to clear and then presented everything simultaneously. "Harold wants to retire," Henry said. She waited. "He has been thinking about it for 2 years," Henry said. "Margaret is in Kansas City. Thomas will be starting his studies in Topeka in the spring. Samuel will follow in his way, and Harold is tired, Winifred, not unhappily, just ready for a different pace. And he wants to know about the ranch," she said. "He wants to offer it," Henry said, "the whole operation, at a fair price with terms that account for the partnership stake I already hold. He wants to go east to Margaret and spend the next part of his life closer to his children." She looked at the stars and the plain and the darkness that was a deep and familiar darkness now rather than the vast unknown darkness of that first night 9 years ago. "Henry," she said. "Yes," he said. "Do you want it?" she said. He was quiet for a long time. She watched his profile in the starlight, the face she had been watching for 9 years, the jaw that was set a little when he was thinking seriously and which she had learned to read the way she had learned to read everything about him, completely and without having to try. "Yes," he said finally. "I want it. I want the land and the work and the life we have here. I want it for James and for Clara and for us." He paused. "But it is not only my wanting that matters." "No," she agreed. "It is not." She thought about what she wanted, which she had become very good at identifying over the past 9 years, having spent too many years before that deliberately not looking at the question. She thought about the kitchen garden and the east pasture and the view at sunset, and the meadowlarks on the fence posts in spring and the kitchen in the early mornings, and the shelves Henry had built, and the curtains she had made and the boy sleeping in the next room, and the girl who followed him everywhere, and the particular quality of the nights on the Kansas plain which were like nothing she had ever seen anywhere else, and which she had never, not once in 9 years, taken for granted. "I want it," she said. They bought the Fenwick Ranch in the spring of 1889, and they renamed it, because Henry said the land deserved the name of the people who were going to grow old on it, and Winifred agreed with complete conviction. They called it the Hadley Ranch. Harold left in May, with a trunk of his own and a new directness in his step that spoke of a man who has made a decision that suits him. And on the morning of his departure, he stood with Henry in the yard, with the particular gravity of 2 men who have worked beside each other for a decade, and who are not given to demonstrative expression, and who are both deeply aware of what is being transitioned. And he put his hand on Henry's shoulder, and said something too low for Winifred to hear from the porch. And Henry nodded, and Harold nodded in return, and that was the fullness of it. He hugged the children. He hugged Winifred last, which she thought might have been intentional, and said into the top of her head, "You were exactly what was needed. I knew it the first evening on the wagon ride." "You could not possibly have known that," she said. "I knew enough of it," he said. She stood on the porch and watched his wagon until the dust took it, and then turned back to the ranch and the children and the morning's work and the life that was, in every direction, entirely and completely hers. The years that followed on the Hadley ranch were the years of their full life together, and they were good years, years of work and growth, and the particular satisfactions of a thing built carefully and maintained with genuine care. The trail driving era was fading by the end of the decade, the railroads having finally extended their reach through Texas and made the long drives largely unnecessary, and the ranch adapted as good operations do, shifting toward quality breeding stock and the shorter drives to the nearby railheads. And Henry navigated these changes with the same practical intelligence he brought to everything, always learning, always adjusting, never losing the core conviction that the land and the cattle and the honest work of it were worth whatever adjustment was required. James grew into himself as the decade turned, a young man of 15 with his father's competence and his mother's argumentative streak, and a gift for the practical management of living things, cattle and horses and the land itself, that Henry recognized and cultivated with quiet pride. He was going to be a rancher in his bones, and he knew it from early and was not conflicted about it, which was its own kind of gift. Clara grew into a girl of 12 who could ride as well as any hand on the ranch, who had read everything in the cottage and most of what was in the main house, who had decided at some point that she was going to be both educated and capable in the physical sense, and had pursued both with a rigor that made Winifred feel, sometimes, that she was watching herself from a distance and considerably more optimistic angle. "She is exactly like you," Henry told her one evening. "I was never that confident at 12, Winifred said. "You were," he said. "You simply were not permitted to express it the same way." She considered this. "That may be true," she said. "It is entirely true," he said, with the absolute certainty of a man who has been paying close attention for a long time. She took his hand and held it, the working man's hand she had first noticed on that early morning in the kitchen, now with more years in it and just as sure. And the plain was dark outside, and the fire was burning low, and James was in bed, and Clara was almost in bed, and the house was full of the particular quiet that comes when everything that matters is within its walls. "Henry," she said. "Yes," he said. "I read that advertisement 17 times, she said. "I know," he said. "Every time I thought I would not answer it," she said. "And then the next day I would read it again." "What made you answer it the 17th time?" he asked. He had asked her this before, in different ways and at different moments, and she had given different pieces of the answer, but she had been thinking about the whole of it lately and thought she might be ready to say it properly. "I was afraid," she said. "But I was more afraid of what the 18th reading would feel like if I still had not answered." He was quiet for a moment, and she felt his thumb move across her hand in the slow, deliberate way of someone who is thinking through touch. "I am glad of the 17th reading," he said. "So am I," she said. The fire crackled and the stars were out over the plain, and the grass was making its page-turning sound in the wind. And Winifred Hadley, who had been Winifred Talbot on a stagecoach heading into the unknown, sat in the house she had made a home, and held the hand of the man she loved and thought about brave things and foolish things, and how sometimes, on the best occasions, they turn out to be the same thing. She thought about all the things she might have been careful about and had not been. About the advertisement and the stagecoach and the first morning in the kitchen and the muddy garden and the midsummer dance and the words said before a cattle drive and the words said after, the proposal at sunset and the marriage in the cold, clear November church and the children and the years of mornings with coffee and the partnership and the hard winter and the plain in spring and the full opened-up life of it. She thought about inattention and about moments. and about the things that people do not say until it is too late to say them. She had said them. He had said them. They were saying them still, every day, in the ways that people in love say things, some with words and some without. Outside, the Kansas plain stretched away in every direction under the enormous sky, the same sky it had always been, indifferent in the grand sense and specific in the way it looked from this particular porch, from this particular life. The wind moved through the grass, and the stars burned cold and clear and far above them, and the meadowlarks would be back on the fence posts in spring as they always were, singing from every post along the road that led from the main gate of the Hadley ranch to the wider world and back again. James would grow into the rancher he was already becoming. Clara would become everything she was already in the process of being. The land would hold them as it had held them. The work would be real, and the days would be full, and the evenings would be as they were now, the two of them on the porch or by the fire, talking or not talking, the comfortable deep language of people who have known each other long enough that the silence is as full as the speech. Henry was looking at her, and she could feel it without turning, the particular quality of his attention that she had known since the first day, and that had not diminished or shifted in character, but had only deepened, the way things that are real deepen rather than wear. She turned and looked at him, and he was looking at her with everything he had always looked at her with, the careful man who had stopped being careful about her specifically, the steady man who had chosen to be steady for her and with her and beside her. And she thought that she was going to be looking at this face for the rest of her life, and that this was the truest and most complete thing she knew about her own future. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. 17, she said. He smiled, the full real smile, and brought her hand up and held it against his chest for a moment where she could feel his heartbeat, steady and warm and present and entirely hers. "I am glad," he said simply. "Henry," she said. "Yes." "So am I," she said, completely and without reservation. The fire burned, and the plain breathed its wide, quiet breath, and the stars held their positions overhead with the patient constancy of things that have always been there and will always be there, witnesses to all the small, consequential moments of human lives below them. And the Hadley ranch settled into the deep, good quiet of a house where the important things have been said, and the people inside it know, with the full weight of hard-earned certainty, that they are exactly where they are supposed to be. The night went on. The stars turned slowly in their long arc. The grass moved. The meadowlarks were sleeping on their fence posts, and in the morning they would sing.